No matter what genre you write, there is a certain degree, a certain element of world building that you have to do. So, in this maybe first episode about world building 101, let's start addressing that. Episode 82 of Horrible Writing. That will never work. You can't publish that. Seriously? Don't. Oh my God, that's another thing to do. That's bad. You probably should find other hobbies. You ever learn how to spell? Stop. Be happy. Quit while you're done. Don't bother. I've seen better. Do you really want to do that? And my third grade, give it up. Welcome to Horrible Writing, the rawest, most candid, in-your-face writing show on the interwebs because none of us have time to suck. Let's do this. Hey everybody, Paul Sading, your host of Horrible Writing. I hope this finds you absolutely well. Can you believe it's already April? Nuts. The world around me is changing. The world around you is changing. Trees are blooming. Now, yes, I realize my bias at the hemisphere I'm in is going to be very related to that. But it's hard to not when you live in Washington State and you get gray a lot. So this is a very green part of the world. It really is. But when the sky is perpetually gray, it really cuts down on your enjoyment of the green that you do have. So now you have blue sky behind the blooming green, and all the other colors. Part of my world. What's that? I have to pay attention to the world around me in order to incorporate it into my fiction? Absolutely you do. We all do. It doesn't matter what you're writing. It doesn't matter the genre. Well, I guess it does if you're writing nonfiction. But even to a degree, you're bringing world into it. You might not be world building. In this episode, we're specifically talking about world building. It's one of those issues that a lot of people are interested in. A lot of people put a lot of thought into it. Some people ignore it. There are people who put too much thought into it and then never really get going because all they ever do is world build. I know a writer who is a very talented writer who has wonderful stories, anecdotes, folklore, if you will, because he's not putting anything down. He's too busy getting lost in the high that is world building. And it's a shame. I mean, he's enjoying himself, so I don't want to judge that. But for the rest of us who could be enjoying his stories, it's a shame that we don't get those because of where he chooses to be. I love world building too. And recently, I got an email from a listener, and she was an incredibly thankful listener. It was very humbling to get her email because she was very complimentary of this show. But in her email, she talked about, can we address world building? I'm going to do that again in a future episode because I want to actually do a panel on it. But for today, I want to start us out with the foundational elements of it, a grounding, if you will. I don't think it behooves anybody to go too deep before getting set. So, world building is driven a lot by genre in part. Is it a period piece? Is it contemporary? What is your genre? Is it horror, sci-fi, fantasy, epic fantasy, dystopic fantasy? Is it a contemporary romance? There's a million factors, which is why this could be a very detailed talk, which is also why it won't be, and I will save that for my panel discussion I'll have later this year with other writers. But for now, one of the first things we have to answer for ourselves is, what am I actually writing? What genre? When I wrote Chasing the Demon, I didn't really have to world build at all. The world is around me. The world took place in many of the places around my home that I actually enjoy. The second book in Subject Found, which is one I'm editing now, it's called Rip. That takes place in Memphis, Tennessee. So a contemporary city, one I've visited, one I've never lived in. Had to do some research, but I based it on facts. Not a whole lot of world building there. Third book in the Subject Found series is Untitled, and no one has an idea what the story is because I haven't told anybody, because it's written in audio drama format and I have to adapt it into a novel. But that one requires a lot of world building. It's the same type of genre. You know, the dark thriller with some fantastical elements, but there's supernatural elements in this one, as opposed to those first two Subject Found books, which required a lot of world building for that genre. Now you compare that to my upcoming audio drama and novel series, Crown of Thieves. It's an epic fantasy based in a medieval-esque world. Everything, being a fantasy work, everything has to be built. And I think this is where the big picture of world building comes in. I feel it can confuse people. It can overwhelm people. I think it behooves you to start as early as possible. It is now April. I have been world building and outlining since December, November for that series. Now, that's not all full time. That's not every available writing minute / research minute dedicated to world building. It's not. In fact, there are times where I will go a week without doing it because I'm trying to clear up everything that's in front of Crown of Thieves, because when I get to that, I want to fully immerse myself in it and invest in it. So it's part and parcel, pieces here and there, months, okay? So don't please let that scare you. But in a genre such as that, fantasy, the world is incredibly important. Incredibly important. It will drive the actions of your characters in a single scene in that first book that you didn't anticipate. It will give you loads, hundreds of sticky notes. Literally, go look at my dining room. Hundreds of sticky notes of story beat ideas because of the geography, the topography, the culture, just that alone. And I think that's where the exploration begins for world building. I am a character-driven writer. I am not a plot-driven writer. I don't care how neat your plot is. If you can't execute it with characters that I can relate to and empathize with and sympathize with and struggle and suffer with, then I don't care. There's a lot of great plot ideas of books that I don't finish because their characters are just interesting. So there's my perspective, my bias, my prerogative, my preference. Take everything that follows with a grain of salt. I develop my characters first, understand who they are first, what they want, long before I worry about their world. Once that is settled is when I'll get into my world building. And basically really free flow it. I know my characters, the main characters, well enough to know the type of world they come from. For example, Crown of Thieves audio drama, not the book series, the audio drama, I knew the main character was going to be a young female and she was going to begin her journey, kind of like a hero's journey, but she was going to begin her journey in a small village. I knew that. As I started building the world, that's where I started from, and everything else spread out from there. There are other things included that were predetermined during the character development. So I don't think it'll surprise any of you. I'm not spoiling anything, but she's a thief. And the audio drama is called Crown of Thieves. it's not a stretch of the imagination to know or anticipate at some point during her story, she's going to run across other thieves. So as I was building her character, I was building other characters, antagonists, etc., allies, which drove me to building a more formal organization. So I knew that thing existed. Well, these people need homes. Where are those homes and how do they impact and interact with allies and antagonists? That's the fun part for me. So when I world build, I start with characters first. I get a good, firm grasp of what I want that story to be. And then I kind of go into a brainstorming session after I have that, even before I do a lot of outlining for the story. So the world of Crown of Thieves, the world is called Alador, and that world is done. It's already, again, I've been working on this for months, but about a week ago, I even commissioned a map, a world map to be done. I now have it. Patrons of the show actually have it as well. One of their benefits of being a patron of this show and all my other podcasts. And in that development, I got myself a sketch pad, an artist sketch pad. I am not an artist. And I started in pencil, of course, with Farlene, the village where the main character begins her journey. And I went out from there, adding places, moving, erasing, adjusting things. And then I freeformed topography, understanding that in a fantasy series, unless you're going to have a completely open world, you have to put limits on yourself. So you put those geographical barriers in the way so you can cut off that world, partition that world, if you will, right? Depending on how much you want to show. I know for right now, definitely for the audio drama, and at least the long beginning of any book series, I know that my world will be the snapshot of what I've created now. There's dozens of villages. There's 3 distinct cultures, a 4th one that's not so distinct, but will come to bear over time. Those were part of that designing phase. So having that fun and letting that free form flow happen allowed me to come to that. I didn't have that originally. When I developed the characters and started developing some of the beats that would go ultimately in some outline, I didn't have those elements. It wasn't until I got in front of that map and I got Farlene set down, the village of Farlene set down. And I knew the first few beats that had to happen. I knew the first plot points that had to happen, I should say, and where that was going to take her. So those inherently are linked to Farlene. Therefore, on that map, I had to dedicate that space to them. And then the world slowly ripples out from there. And when I came to that fulfillment, I took some time to, include those geographic and geological formations and mountain ranges and a basin and an ocean/sea. I wanted to incorporate those in there. I wanted some force. I knew what the world was going to be. There are parts of that world that are going to be very much like the world I love, the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. Green and robust with life and a little too gray sometimes, but I didn't want all of that because every fantasy ever, every epic medieval fantasy ever made always happens in something that looks like old Europe, right? So I wanted to be careful to not dedicate solely to that. That was a deliberate idea I had while I was world building. And I think you're hearing me emphasize this over and over and over because I think that's important. Brainstorming is about not judging. It's about getting out all of those ideas without judgment, without that filter. So this deliberate process of getting a firm grasp of the main players and a little bit of their world, and then opening those floodgates when drawing out a very sketchy stick figure map has led to those other things. Led to the idea that, yeah, she starts in medieval, in a, old European type of medieval village. Is that something I want to dedicate an entire audio drama to? And then a book series that could range anywhere from, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 books up to 20 books. I don't know. I'm not going to worry about that right now. And I knew I didn't want to stay in a world like that for that long. So what am I going to do? Well, I want other types of environments. Well, how are you going to create those environments? Well, I'm going to put this mountain range from here to here that blocks off weather patterns, right? So now all of a sudden, this is a desert world with a desert people. In this mountain range, as this world evolved, these pockets of people wouldn't have necessarily interacted from the dawn of humankind or person kind. There would have been pockets. So there's a distinct culture here. They would not share these values. And then I got to start developing culture. And then the bigger picture is it snowballs from there. You've got to think about, don't think in terms of plot point development and beat development. Look at the world around you and have fun with it. What are the things that you interact with on a daily basis that would have a appropriate place in your story? You went to the grocery store at some point this week. You had to buy that stuff unless you stole it. I'm hoping I don't have any thieves among my listeners. So yeah, you paid with a debit card, but that's just a mechanism. It's a monetary mechanism, just like coin has been historically. But there's other forms of fiduciary trading happening, right? I mean, what would be appropriate in your world? Have fun with. Spend a day thinking about that alone. What would be exchanged for goods? Don't go anywhere else. If you're like, oh, I need to worry about languages. Yeah, worry about languages some other time. Today, get a sticky note out, get a pad of paper out, and brainstorm what money or how goods would be exchanged. What would that be? How would people travel? What would the measurements be? Is it going to be in miles or kilometers? Yawn. Right? How would they measure that? Getting from point A to point B. Start brainstorming. Maybe that's where people start. Start brainstorming a list of all the things that you would need to do. That doesn't work for me. I couldn't do that. I'd get too distracted and overwhelmed. I start with the simple, bigger pictures. And I think you'll find if you do that, you start from the big, work to finer detail, you will find a sense of control and a sense of accomplishment because you're defining your world in a sense of journey, right? You're exploring this. You're building this from scratch. And it's a lot of fun. It's a whole lot of fun. But before we get out of here, one word of warning. Going back to my friend who has spent his whole life, instead of storytelling, he spent it world building. Always consider your genre's tolerance for space. How much space do you have to world build? I made a mistake in chasing the demon. It was not only my first novel, but it was a novel that was adapted from a podcast. And the podcast is obviously just dialogue. The sound design in that podcast also helped build the world, but it wasn't what I wrote some cues in there and the sound designer went and did his awesome thing with it. When I adapted that to the novel, I had to replace that, and I let my passions get the better of me, and I overdeveloped a world that's very familiar to people. And, that's one of the drags on the pacing in that book. It's something I learned. It's something I definitely avoided in 12 Deaths of Christmas. It's definitely something that got avoided in The Scales or Rip, these other books that are coming up, hopefully soon. So how much space does your genre have for world building? If it's a tight action thriller, you're not going to get a whole lot of space for it, right? If it's a period piece, depending on the period, you may. If it's a romance, I keep going back to romance and I don't read it, so I don't really know that well. If it's more of a mass market type, you might not have that allowance for it. Horror doesn't necessarily have allowance for big world building. Sci-fi, fantasy, they do. Be sure that you're aware of that first. Those are your constraints. That's your market expectation. Now, if you don't care about selling a book ever, fine. Go break all the rules. But if you do have aims of selling and building upon selling that first book or the fifth book or whatever, that is something you have to be responsible to yourself for. You don't get it both ways. Very few people break all the rules and are sell like gangbusters. That's the anomaly, unfortunately. So I want to address this again in the future, but I do want to do it with other writers because I think that's the right thing to do. I hope this gets you started and gets you thinking and brainstorming and world building. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a couple minutes to go leave a rating and review for it. I don't have nearly enough of them, and I know there's enough of you. So please go do that. If you want extra content, I'm about to go give some extra content on this topic to my patrons every episode. Fiction stories, flash fiction, longer fiction. If you want access to the audiobooks, if you want a choose your own adventure audio drama, and if you want a medieval fantasy, Crown of Thieves, you need to become a patron. Some of that stuff starts out as low as $1 a month, and all of it's price friendly, even up from there. We don't do any price gouging. I'm anti-price gouging. So become a patron. Patreon.com/Paul Sading. Until episode 83, keep being epic. This has been Horrible Writing, and hopefully after this episode, you suck less than you did at the beginning. I am Paul Sading, your host extraordinaire. You can find me over on the Twitterverse @WritingHorrible and over at paulsading.com/horrible-writing. Until next time, suck less.